everybody, to our next episode of Ask a Pro. I am really excited to be able to have Donahue Casazza, who is an MBA renowned coach and mentor for personal corporations, companies, business owners, and someone who I myself have personal experience with and really want to say how much I've gotten out of our conversations. And one of the main driving reasons why we're doing this webinar today is to be able to offer some insight on how people can deal with the dynamic of having a family member, for me, my father-in-law, move onto your property. So welcome, Naheed.
Thank you so much, David. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, it is going to be fun. We have the next 60 plus minutes to be able to kind of dive into some things. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be sharing some personal sort of, situations, and I'd love to kind of get your feedback on it. There are a few elephants in the room that we really, truly haven't really wrestled with. And luckily, we don't feel that those things are, just going to kind of crush down on us anytime soon. But it is going to be something that we have to deal with, and they're not going to be, they're difficult topics.
Mm-hmm.
Before we dive into that, everybody, welcome if you're joining us live. We are now currently live streaming on Facebook. And of course, if you're on the Zoom, you're here with us and seeing it. If you're going to be watching it in the future or listening to a podcast that we post, just check, for the links. You're going to have a way to get a hold of Naheed. You'll have her website information there. If you have any questions, and I hope you do, you can put those into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. So with that, Naheed, tell us just a little bit about you and your background.
Okay, well, I've always been interested in psychology, so that's kind of what was my main interest. But I went into corporate and worked as a recruiter, and then I worked in the high tech world. So I got a lot of experience in that world, but then it came time to start my own thing, and I gravitated back to psychology. So I've been coaching now for over 20 years. I started doing career transition coaching, and then I started working with business owners. And lately I've been doing, probably in the past decade, I've been doing tons of work in leadership development. But the thing that they all have in common is that psychology. So there's always psychological reasons behind the problems that we face, and those are invisible. So people say, for example, why are the people on my team not getting along? Or it's the same reason maybe is why the siblings in your family are fighting. So there are a lot of psychological dynamics that I teach my clients that help them not only in their business life, but also in their personal life.
And I think that's one, and just a little bit of background for everybody. Setting up and having companies, because we have the ADU University, we have Jumpstart ADU, we have YIMBY ADU, we have a couple other things, and working in partnership with other people who have companies is difficult because you have your own business, you have a lot of obligations and responsibilities, and if you need to kind of work as a team. And that is where I got a lot of value out of our time together. It's just how you can kind of manage expectations, because I think it's very interesting. You really have control over how you react to a situation.
Yes.
And I think that was critical. But then there's also the one thing that I've gotten recently, and I heard recently, is how you can set boundaries, particularly when it comes, and that kind of gets into what I want to really kind of dive into it. And when I paint this picture of what our situation is because setting those boundaries, whether it's when you're working with somebody else in the corporate world, or you're working with you're kind of dealing with your parent or a sibling, and setting that can really help you be able to manage your time. One of the things, as you and I were kind of getting ready for this webinar, you sent me what I thought was really fantastic, is that when you have a parent move in, I mean, for me, at this moment right now, 20 feet to my right is where my father-in-law lives in our ADU. And my wife is working on some things out of the house. She works from home. But before she left, she said, make sure you give the blueberries and the hard-boiled eggs to Chuck. And so I said, okay. So we're lucky. That's not a big responsibility, but it's something that is kind of easy to do. So pulling back for people that are who are thinking about or have their parent live with them, the part that we kind of went through and may not have done as well as we should have was really setting up the conversation of what it's going to be like when they do move in. And lucky for us, Chuck, my father-in-law, was not a hoarder. He didn't have a ton of stuff, and he was selling it for probably, a year as he were getting ready for the ADU construction. He was really sort of paring down and getting rid of all of his things. So we didn't have a lot of anxiety or stress. And I've heard that from a lot of people. It's like, how do you get through those things? The one thing that I think for us that was also important is just the familial dynamic with, because it's my wife's father, and my wife has a fraternal twin sister, and they both happen to be attorneys. They both happen to be very type A personalities. And I think that's what attracted me to my wife. She has a lot of confidence. But when you come with that, the dynamics of a family is critical to kind of get in front of, because their father is there, and there are some financial obligations that we have when he's there. And we're not getting, the other part of it is that we're not getting the rent that we could if we were renting it out. Because I'm in Burbank, California. Rents for this 734 square foot ADU are probably about $3,200 to $3,400 a month. And that's considerable. So if you're giving that up, which we're happy to give up, how do you have that conversation in the difficult one? So how would you coach or advise somebody who has not had the fortune to talk to somebody like you? How would you coach somebody who's like, oh crap, how do I even begin the process?
Well, money is a big issue, and it's a lot more complex, I think, than even you guys are dealing with yet, which is a good thing for you. But, first of all, there's the difference between how the parent expects to spend their money. And as you're starting to change roles and you're becoming more of an authority figure, especially if your parent has dementia, how you think the money should be spent. And then if you have siblings, how they think money should be spent. And what I see over and over again is that one sibling thinks something is necessary. Like, we need to buy dad a new couch, or we need to get his hair and beard trimmed every week, or mom needs a caregiver and she needs this specific home, and someone else is spending a lot of time with mom. And so the siblings are all going to have a different idea of what is needed, and they're going to have a different idea of what's fair and what the values are. So it's almost like, if you're going to be able to have these conversations with your siblings, you have to get detached from what you believe is fair, because it's never going to be fair. It's never going to be fair, because everyone has a different opinion on what's needed and what the value of, let's say, somebody's time is. So if someone is putting a lot more time in than somebody else, how do you even value that? Well, one sibling might have a different opinion than another. So there's just a lot of those kinds of issues. And what I find is that when the family members get their priorities kind of straight, and they say, okay, my relationship with my parent and my siblings is more important according to my values than whether I get the exact same amount of money as them from an inheritance, or whether what my rules for being fair are agreed upon by the others, or whether my siblings agree that I buy this thing, and since they don't agree but I think it's necessary, I'm just going to buy it as a gift and I'm not going to worry about it. Those issues, there's a certain amount of detachment that you sometimes have to have. When I run into the most sibling problems, it's when one sibling says, hey, let's all split this. Dad or mom needs this. Let's all split it, because dad or mom don't think it's necessary, or they're not going to pay for it right now. So let's just split it. And some of the siblings feel bullied into that. Some of them don't agree.
Well, the part that I think you were touching on that I thought was what is very important is that is the sibling dynamics.
Yes,
Because some people are thinking, no, they need to have it. They need to have his haircut every 1 or 2 weeks.
right.
When dad might be going, I'm happy for a month. I don't
Mm-hmm.
need to have them in here doing whatever. And so it's like, no, but I need to. So you get into that family dynamic where you're again kind of butting heads. And what you just said is like, okay, you are going to need to let go of those things and don't
Yes.
hold on to them so tightly. And you need to be able to keep in focus what's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I had a client who uh, thought it would be great to invest in a legacy plaque, I think at a school or something, on behalf of the parent, got all the siblings to agree to contribute. And then 2 years later, the contributions weren't coming in and wasn't understanding why. And a lot of it was because some of them felt bullied into doing it. So there's really this detachment that has to happen. And then the parent themselves are going to have different money values, and they're going to be a little bit offended at the kids suddenly deciding what they do and don't need. So this idea of, I need my haircut. Well, maybe I'm a little bit more nervous about money because I don't have a steady income other than Social Security, which is nothing. So maybe I want to be more frugal. And you, as a younger person with more money coming in, you have different ideas of what's needed.
Because, and this is the one thing that I think is going to be a reoccurring theme with the a parent who is not incapacitated, does have their faculties, is the pride factor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one thing that I've found with Chuck is he's like, I don't want to bother you.
Yes.
And we're like, okay. And so when I hear that, I hear like a dozen different things. It's like, okay, he doesn't want to bother us. He may not know. He may want some help with something. He may not want to do something, but he's pretty good at stuff. I don't want to do that. So we're lucky that way. But still, there's a lot of stuff where we're like, okay, how do we encourage him to lean on us? Because it's only been just over 6 months that he's been here. And I want
Mm-hmm.
to let everybody know they don't settle in after being where he was, which was in Palm Desert for, I think, 11 years. And then he gets out of the gated community that he lived in, where he knows how to get to everywhere. And then he comes over to Burbank. One, there's a lot more traffic, there's a lot more activity, everything's brand new. And for an 87-year-old, that can be overwhelming.
Yes.
And that's the part where when you said money values, it's just like, okay. And then the pride issue, it's like you have to kind of be sensitive and aware of that they may not ask. And so you might be a little bit more inquisitive and maybe leading. I don't know.
Yeah, we had a similar issue with my dad. So he's approaching 90. He's in the early stages
Wow.
of Alzheimer's, and he wants to stay in his house, but he doesn't want to let go of driving. And so we spent a lot of time trying to get him to let go of driving. And we sort of put it on the doctor, like the doctor said, and the doctor did say, but he basically didn't want to wake up my brother and ask for a ride anywhere. He just didn't want to. And we provided all sorts of resources. We have someone coming over twice a week who can drive you on errands. There's a free service here. We can, my brother's living at home with you. He can drive you places. And my dad is like, I wake up in the morning and your brother's not even up yet, and I want my cereal and I want to go to the store and get it, and I know where the store is and it's not far and I know how to drive and I'm safe and blah blah blah. So the doctor kind of threw us under the rug and gave him permission to go back to driving. It's just, there's so many psychodynamics that are important, and for him, just being empowered to do those things is important. And so it's kind of like you sort of have to do a dance. How much are you going to protect them? How much are you going to jump in and do things for them? Let them write their own checks, take care of their bills. How much do you jump in and take over? And none of it's clean. None of it's black and white. It's all these ongoing conversations, these ongoing negotiations. And as you said, sometimes you really have to ask and say, all right, what is it that really matters to you? Because you jump in, you start taking over, and you forget that they've been on this earth many years, and while they may be having trouble with some of their memory, or they may be slower to get around, they still have opinions. They still have a way that they've been living, and they've been living independently. And you've been their kid, for God's sake. So since when do you get to boss them around or jump in and tell them what to do? So it's subtle. They do need your help, but they kind of need it given graciously.
Yes, and it is. And I think that that's the part, because when if in our situation, we accepted the fact that we knew that Chuck was going to be here, that we were not going to get the rent, and that this is going to be the last place that he was going to basically be. If we're lucky, we don't have to put him in anywhere. He's always just, we want him here for as long as he can. And we knew that and it is going to have some sacrifice. But I think that the way that I look at it, I think that the trade-off is definitely much greater than any of the sacrifice. Now, I'm talking from my own perspective. My wife may have a completely different perspective because of the obligation and responsibility that she feels she has. And I think that that's where, some people may be really struggling. They may have the parent. I mean, people who are watching now or could be watching this in the future, it's like, holy cow, how am I going to do that? And then and they may not, then the parent may be in a situation where they have money, great, or they don't have money. Then how do you do those things? And how do you have those, and how do you encourage them to try to be as vibrant and as enjoying life to the fullest level that they can? And I think that that's where we are. And I mentioned it a minute ago that he's only been here 6 months. And I think the topic was, I think this was in some of your outlines, I think, is that it takes a while for somebody who's been in a routine for a very long time, who's older, when they're uprooted and then moved, to get into a new routine. And that could take a while, couldn't it?
It definitely does. I mean, you're completely out of your element. And I think that can be jarring. And also, you mentioned the sense of obligation. And I think when you're the host, when you're bringing your parent to come live with you, there's all sorts of internal stuff going on that you might not even be aware of, like your sense of obligation. How much time do I spend with my parent who's living here? When do I leave them alone? When do I just go off on my own? Because normally when your parent visits, you modify your life to spend time with them because they're leaving again. But when they come and they move in permanently, then there's this question like, do we eat dinner together every night? Do we have meals together? Do we do social things together? Do we go to the store together? And in order for them to develop their own life, they have to make new friends that live sort of near. And so there's this whole thing that is often invisible because people don't talk about it or think about it until it happens. And even when it's happening, sometimes we're just reacting to it. We don't really see it because a lot of it's the old stuff that comes up. We don't see our sense of obligation. We don't see our guilt. We just sort of feel it and respond to it. So you talked about the elephants in the room. These are the elephants in the room. And sometimes this is when it's helpful to talk to somebody outside of the situation to help sort through what's really going on.
Let's take a second. I'm going to kind of deviate just a moment,
Okay.
and really kind of dive into that, what you just said, which is where you might need to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
I think that my generation, and particularly my parents' generation, really did not. You had to be self-reliant. You had to be able to have the strength and the fortitude to do this on your own. You don't need any help. But you could be living under such immense pressure or stress or anxiety, or where you're not sleeping, anything that could be contributing to the fact that you're not as relaxed or as calm as you were, maybe not as you were, or that you'd like to be.
Mm-hmm.
And you're really like, this is difficult. And you're having, what are those moments when would somebody really benefit for taking a pause to go, I think I might need some coaching. I think I might need some guidance.
Great question. So I would say if you're noticing that you're experiencing more stress or more exhaustion or more resentment, than you'd like to be experiencing. And it feels different than it felt before. I mean, ideally, if you're feeling any stress or resentment or exhaustion, you want to be talking to a coach anyway, or to somebody anyway. And this is not because there's anything wrong with you. It's just that when we feel these things, usually we're responding to things that are invisible. And so we just don't have visibility into all of it. And it does just take somebody outside. So that's, for example, why a business owner or a leader will hire a coach, because they only experience things from their vantage point. And with the coach's help, they can see how an employee or team member might experience them. And that's what makes them more effective. So that's why someone who leads a company might hire a coach, but any human being that is experiencing anything, you're going to have blind spots about that thing. So if you want to navigate through it, you've been trying to navigate through it and you're experiencing some kind of confusion about it, you're not quite sure what's going on, you're just feeling more worn down, that's a signal to talk to somebody. And you don't have to have a lot of conversations. You can have 3 to 5 conversations just to get your head clear.
I want to kind of go into that a little bit more, because the one thing that I wrote down that I think is probably one of the most things that I've seen, one that I've seen the most, is resentment.
Mm-hmm.
I resent the responsibility. I
Yes.
resent the obligation. I resent that I'm not getting the help from somebody that I think that they should be giving me as you said, the host. I should be there. So, or it's like, why is it you feel an obligation and you're responding to that obligation, and now you have the resentment.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where, if you feel those things, like, and it may manifest in a different way, like they should be doing more.
Yes.
So talk about that if you can. So and I want to try to make it very simple, simpler for most people that may not understand what resentment may manifest or exhibit, how it may manifest or how it may exhibit.
So, I mean, I think we probably all know what the feeling of resentment is, right? Typically, we're feeling resentful because we're doing something we don't think we should have to be doing, right? And we're extending ourselves more than we think we should have to. This is where good boundaries come in, though, because what we don't realize is that the way we're experiencing it is those expectations are coming from outside of us. And we're so used to them that we don't think about the fact that we're creating that sense of obligation inside of us. And we're telling ourselves that this is how it should be. And in order for me to be a good daughter, I have to do these things for my parent. And I assume that my parent expects these things from me. But if I actually was able to sit down and have an authentic conversation with my parent, I might find that my parent is spending the time with me for many of the same reasons, because they feel obligated to, to be there for me. So having the conversation is really important. But to simplify it, when you're feeling resentment, it's a feeling of tiredness or a feeling of just kind of a little bit of anger for something that you're doing that you don't feel like you should have to be doing, and it feels a little bit unfair.
I thank you for that. And I really appreciate that explanation and that insight. And that's the part where I want to really encourage people. And I appreciate also the fact that you said it doesn't need to be a huge investment of time or money. It can be it's a few conversations, and like you just want to kind of get your perspective centered again. You want to kind of have your head kind of cleared, and then to kind of calm things down. And I think that the part that you mentioned, or not is it the boundaries or the expectations, or just being able to say, hey, here, let's kind of set up a routine, so that, and then have the conversation of, what do you want that routine to look like?
Absolutely. And sometimes you don't even have to have conversation about it. Although if you can have that conversation, that's always the best case scenario. But I have an example for you. I had a client who had her elderly mother move in with her, and they were in this small 2-bedroom apartment. And and her mother had onset dementia. So there was that too. But she still worked. So she would go to work all day and she would come home and she would feel tired. And her mom was just there. And there was all this resentment. And she found herself snapping at her mom. And she didn't mean to snap at her mom, but she just felt like she never got time to just sit in front of the television and zone out, which is how she used to relax after she went to work. So we talked about it. And this is an example of a boundary. And this one wasn't even discussed. The boundary was, I will bring coffee home for my mother because that was the beginning of routine. And as soon as I come home, we'll sit at the table for 1 hour. And during that 1 hour, I will be 100% attentive to my mother. But as soon as that hour's up, then I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to my own bedroom and read, or I'm going to watch television or whatever. And mom just fell into that routine. And it was beautiful the way the dynamic switched, because that dynamic was built out of a lot of stuff that wasn't ever talked about, right? Mom didn't know when she was going to get quality time with her daughter, so she just always stood around expectantly. But then as the routine started, what she learned is that when my daughter comes home, she's going to be there for me. We can talk about our days, but then she's going to go off and do her own thing. So then she would just start expecting that hour, really looking forward to it. And then when the hour was up, she would go do her own thing too. And her daughter was in the house, maybe watching television, but she wouldn't go bother her daughter anymore because she had already had that time and she just fell into the routine.
And how, just out of curiosity, how long did it take for the daughter and for you to help the daughter to see that?
Not very long. I mean, we just had one conversation and she tried it.
And then it worked.
And then we visit, we were doing coaching for other reasons too, but that was one coaching conversation about what was going on. We decided to try that as a solution. And she came back and she told me it was working beautifully in the next coaching conversation.
So
it doesn't always work beautifully the first thing we try, but in that case it did.
And so the example, which I think I really appreciate, is that this is something that she was struggling with. She brought it up. She was fortunate enough to be able to was having conversations and said, hey, this is something that I'm struggling with, or it's difficult. You have a suggestion. She tried it, and it probably very likely changed the time that she has. Now she has her own time.
Mm-hmm.
She's able to do something.
Yeah, it's really easy when you think about, because in these situations, now, of course, there are deep-seated things that are going to take a little bit more time to work through. Sure. But some of these things are just going, wow, I actually don't have to spend all my time with my parent, right? I actually am not obligated to cook dinner every night. And do I really want to, or how many nights do I? And then you find out that your parent doesn't want to make you feel bad, which is why they're eating dinner, but they don't usually eat that much anymore. And they would really prefer to just maybe have one dinner a week with you, and then maybe just take a walk with you every night instead of having this big, heavy meal. So just really looking at, what are my assumptions? What am I assuming that's creating this sense of obligation? And then can I have a conversation about it? And really, as you said, just be curious and find out what the other person wants. And then,
yeah, because you have, it's the lens. That's
it's the lens.
What is your lens? So my wife and I were looking at this relationship through our lens.
Yes.
Breakfast, lunch, dinner. And that we pop out of bed at, in the morning early. Chuck doesn't pop out of bed and get going until 11 a.m. That just happens to be his routine. The lucky person that he is, retired, 87, he gets to get up, go and get going at his own time.
Yeah.
I hope I'm that lucky. So we're like, well, don't you want to have breakfast? No, I usually don't eat until, 12:30. So that's his first meal. And then it may be a little bit light. And so, but his larger, more formal meal is going to be about 5 or 6 o'clock. And that's it. So we're just like, oh, that's different than what we do. But it wasn't too much of an adjustment. And so that was kind of like, okay, it was manageable. So I like the part that we're talking about the boundaries. You're kind of setting some time boundaries to say, hey, this is when we can do things. You're talking about when interacting with them of what they can do. But let's say that the money issue, because and these are some of the elephants
Mhm.
It's sitting down and saying, okay, we know that if they're lucky enough to be able to have, Social Security, some sort of a retirement account, or they do have some sort of resources. There needs to be the kind of, okay, and what do you do as a child? It's like, because you feel like you may feel some obligation to not charge them as
Mhm.
much as you should. Now, and that's I would hope everybody would have that sense. We don't want to charge them anything that's not fair or right.
Right.
That sense of fairness may be different that we may have than another sibling may have, or what they may have. So having that conversation, I always kind of I always think you have to rip the Band-Aid off. Even though you don't want to go, oh, by the way, Chuck, you need to give us this much money, or we're going to need this much money, or we'd like that much money a month. So that's one of the most uncomfortable things that gets me kind of like, okay, how do we do this? Because I don't want to put on my business hat and talk to it to him in that manner. But would it be helpful if that was it, or what would you suggest?
So, what I've had a lot of, I guess, luck with, or what's worked really well for me, is this. Whenever I have a conversation with a family member about money, or a very close friend about money, so we have this relationship that's very personal, but now we're going to do some kind of a business transaction. I usually start with, this is what it normally costs, right? So this is what I would normally rent the ADU out for if somebody I didn't know was staying in it. You're staying in it. And so I want, to do something that works well for you, friends and family discount, et cetera. But I want to know what makes sense for you. So you're negotiating, but you're not negotiating hard. You're basically saying, this is kind of where I'm at, right? This is where I'm at. This is where I would normally be. I'm willing to go down with you, but I don't know how much is reasonable. What is something that you would have expected, like, what's a comfortable amount for you to feel comfortable paying rent and not get anxious that you're going to run out of money, or that you're not going to have budget, or whatever. And a lot of times you can say, we can go down on the amount and we can defer some of it until, I mean, these are hard things to talk about, but if there's any money left over at the end, we can actually say that I'll add $1,000 more to the rent for all the months that I rent there. We'll add that part to your part of the inheritance, if there's any inheritance, right? And if there isn't, you're going to have to forego it. But these are just the kinds of conversations. You can have these conversations with love if you're not struggling with your own resentments and your own sense of fear about what's fair, and is my sibling going to get more or less than I do, or anything like that. That's why you have to have that healthy detachment. But if you can do this with detachment, usually you can get to a really good response.
And I think that that's important that you mentioned that, and I want to kind of reiterate it, is the detachment.
Mm-hmm.
Because you do feel that, as we've been talking about, an obligation, and kind of removing yourself from the situation, and then saying, what do you think, or what would that work? And there's actually several components. There's a couple parts of that comment that I want to kind of pull apart. One is with them, the parents,
Mm-hmm.
and one would be with the sibling that you may have.
Right.
And that's the conversation that we had. We had this conversation with this, my wife's sister, that we could be renting it out for here. We're not going to be getting anywhere close to that for Chuck. And so that difference, we were talking to Vicky, my wife was talking to her sister, just to say, when whatever's left over, and her perspective was, we don't want to take any money from what he has in his resources. We want to keep as much there in his savings account as possible. Because if he runs into a situation where he's going to be needing it, assisted
Mm-hmm.
living,
Right.
a caregiver to come in, those things add up very quickly and
Right.
are expensive. And how do you managing that? To get to that conversation, it took my wife quite a bit of time.
Yes.
To prepare her sister to to get ready for it. So she was looking at this conversation for 6, 7, 8 months, and was slowly kind of getting her ready to kind of say, okay, dad's moving in, here's what we got, and this is just going to be when he does transition, this is how it's going to kind of balance out. And so, but that was the verbal part. We still don't have it in writing. And
maybe you'll get it in writing. And the other thing that you might deal with, so I think this is a good example. This is a good example of siblings maybe not being on the same page. And so there may need to be some detachment and some negotiation. So for example, sister might say, and I actually don't know what sister did say, but sister might say, yeah, well, you do have this beautiful ADU. You are going to be able to make long-term benefits out of it. And maybe you will struggle to get renters, right? Maybe you'll end up with squatters. I mean, you never know what would have actually happened if you weren't have your nice dependable dad in there. So maybe, maybe I shouldn't have to give you the equivalent of what you think market value is, but maybe I will give you a little bit, so those conversations can be had, again, lightly, when people aren't overly attached. Where all the problems come is when people start reacting and they start feeling like they're being taken advantage of, and they start feeling like things are unfair. So that's really the part you have to work on when it comes to your own emotional intelligence, how self-aware you are, and how you're responding to your own triggers or reactions. And so, for example, I do this work with every single client I have, no matter what the context, whether it's personal, whether it's leadership, whether it's business. You need to know what your triggers are. You need to know what's behind those triggers, because every time you are stressed out or resentful or reacting to something, and you're in a conversation with somebody, that conversation is not going to go well.
I like that. Know your triggers. And I think that that's the part that you have to have some sort of responsibility. It's not just making sure that the other person makes a concession. That's not how it works. You're not being flexible. If you're not flexible, you're not understanding that you need to be aware and conscious of the situation as much as possible, you're not going to really be able to change it.
Right.
You're saying, no, okay, it's like, all right, I know that I get mad when. Okay, David, that's a trigger.
Yes.
What happened to get you to that? Oh my gosh, and then to be able to kind of walk through. And I know that you and I actually did that. We actually said, why is this? Why they're not doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of walk through it where it's like, okay, now let's kind of get back and figure out how we can kind of look at this from a different angle, a different perspective, to see if you can't get the result that you'd like.
Yeah. Our triggers, what we don't realize is when we're triggered, what the experience is I'm being triggered by this thing that somebody else is doing, or I'm being triggered by this situation, or maybe usually it's something somebody's doing, or it's a situation. But what's really triggering you is not that other person or the situation, it's the story in your head that you just made up about what it means, right? So if someone's being reticent to agree to what you're proposing, and the story you're making up about that is that they're disrespecting you, you're going to get really mad. If the same thing happens and they're reticent to agree with what you're proposing, and the story that you make up about that is they're a little bit nervous, completely different emotional response. It will not trigger you, and it will actually probably lead you to bridging more of whatever the disagreement is, asking more questions, that sort of thing. So it's the story you're making up in your head. That's where the self-awareness comes in. What are the stories that I make up in my head that trigger me? And then the situations are sort of the thing that kind of gets that process going. So situations are triggers, but the stories in your head are the things that make them triggers.
This brought me back to something that I was working on with you, and I had not ever really seen it, but the fact, because I'll explain it. I always go into a conversation or a negotiation with an expectation, problem one, that the person I'm talking to has the ability to see the whatever the issue is with the same clarity that I have.
Right.
So that if you're not being able to discuss the topic with the clarity that I think you should have, created some frustration.
Right. Because your only way to interpret it then, for example, if they don't respond in a way that makes any sense, your only way to interpret that is either they're stupid or they're incompetent or they're trying to, bamboozle you in some way. I know that's kind of an old, outdated word, but they're just trying to get away with something. But if you consider the option that they're really looking at this completely different and they're not seeing it the same way, you're not going to get triggered. You're going to get curious, and it's going to lead you to ask more questions. And if we jump to older people, older parents, I would say that the typical stories that are upsetting to people is, I have to be X in order to be a good daughter or son.
Right.
I have to be this way in order to be a good daughter or son, or in order to still be respected, right? So there is an idea I have in my head conditions that I've put on myself that tell me that I have to be this way, or my siblings have to be this way in order for it to be fair. So I have stories about what's fair, and I have stories about who I have to be in order to be good at whatever role I've chosen to take on in my family.
And I think that that's the part that I hope people can understand and really kind of reach and to say that if you're holding on to these narratives, you're holding on to these expectations or these mindsets, and you just are just constantly triggered and angry and mad and just so frustrated with whether it's your parent or the sibling or somebody else, that is going to be a very good indicator to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Just to kind of, and I'm not talking, okay, there's not to talk to say there's something wrong with you. That's not it. You just
No, because everybody has it. Everybody has different things that trigger them. And most people are not aware of it, and they simply live in the world and they react and they get stressed and they have conflict and they just deal with all that. I'm just here to tell you, you don't have to.
Well, and that's the other part of it that I wish, you also using another sort of personal example. My mother passed from Alzheimer's, and she had it for 8 years, and her husband, who, then they were married for decades, wonderful man. He was very prideful, and he felt that it was his obligation to take care of her. And he manifested resentment and anger about the situation. And he did all those things you mentioned a moment ago, Nahid. He snapped at her. He would yell, why can't you it was things like being able to get your clothes out and put them on. I mean, it got to that where he, and it was this example that I almost had this, out of body experience going, I wish he was the type of, he could have had a chance to talk about it. And if he could have understood it, because my sister and I both were, concerned about it. But I was in California, and they lived in Oregon. My sister was close in Seattle, and she was just amazing the way that she would go in there and try to help him say, it's okay, you don't have to have this obligation. She was trying to get him to disconnect a little bit so that his life could improve. And that was hard to watch, because it really had a physical impact on his health. So these things that you're talking about is like it could actually affect your quality of life.
Oh, yes.
And tell me, you've had to have seen that in countless situations.
Definitely. I'm even thinking of the neighbor across the street. His wife is starting, and my husband will say they'll be chatting, and his wife will come up and say something that makes no sense, and then the guy gets embarrassed, and so he snaps at his wife. But my husband doesn't care. He knows what's going on. He just responds to her. He may not have any idea what she's talking about, but he is absolutely fine with it. And there's this embarrassment that we have, and this sense of obligation and all these things. But the thing is as we get stressed, we're causing them more stress.
Right.
So our disapproval, they don't want us to disapprove. They're trying their best. I have a client who is a doctor that works specifically with the elderly the end of life phase of a person's life. And he recommended this book to me, and I can't remember the author of it off the top of my head, but it's called The 36-Hour Day. And as soon as he found out that my father might be diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia, he told me to read that. And one of the most important things that that book said is here's what to expect. These are the kinds of things that are going to happen. They're going to have difficulty putting on their clothes. They're not going to be able, they're going to do all these things that seem very irritating. And they outline all these behaviors that are extremely irritating. Like, it seems like they're doing things on purpose to trigger you, and they aren't. And she explains, or in the author in the book explains, that this is what happens. This is how the behavior manifests, and they're just trying their best. And I think that's really valuable to understand, is that as people get older and they start exhibiting behaviors that feel annoying, they're not trying to be annoying. They're just trying to get their needs met the best they can.
I think that you touched on something that I really resonated, and that is they're trying their best.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that I could see in my mother as she was struggling with the disease, is that she really connected with the energy that a person had. She wasn't able to really verbalize it. She might pat you on your face, but she really connected. So if her husband was mad at her, she would kind of go, "What? Well, why is he mad?"
Yeah.
And you could see that, and that is something that my sister struggled with, where she was like, she could see the reaction of the connection. And that's why I really am happy that she was conscious and aware of it, would talk to him about it, just to say that, Madeline, my mother, your wife, is not doing it on purpose.
Right.
And she's trying, and she reacts to how you're feeling. And I think that is important. I want to kind of transition to something about your having it and your parent living in your home. They've been relocated, and then we've touched on it a couple ways, but there's something we've done. I want to spend a little bit more time focusing on getting them comfortable, getting them situated, and then not trying to be over, really, over them to say, hey, let's do this, do that. Is being able to have the expectations as the kid, the host, for your parent, but you still want to encourage them to get out. What is the best way to kind of say, okay, we've now ripped them out of their comfortable environment that they were in, hoping it was comfortable, and now they're in this brand new place. And you said it a moment ago earlier on, make new friends. What? You're 87. How do you make new friends? Where do you go and how do you do that? How do you encourage it? Because everything that I've read, and I've done some research, that really can improve the quality of life. And I think you might have actually included that. So how does somebody with, let's say we're not having to deal with a lot of conflict or big issues, but how do you get to just the basics of try to make it as comfortable for them in this new environment, in this new space?
Great question. So there's a lot of approaches, but so the first approach I would say is you want to try to pay attention to what your parents' routines have been, what their living routine was, and see what pieces of that you can kind of use to emulate it. So for example, if there's a church, right? If there's a practice of going to church or going to synagogue or any kind of religious practice, usually if you can bring them with you and introduce them to people within that environment. So if they're spiritual, and if there's a nearby church, that's kind of a place often to build community. Usually there's a senior center in most communities. So you do have to take into consideration how extroverted or introverted your parent is, and what makes sense to them. If they are more extroverted, then taking them maybe to a senior center, doing activities might be good. If they're introverted, like my dad, one-on-one tends to be better. And so if you know someone about their age that you think they might relate to, maybe inviting them to dinner and, trying to maybe facilitate a one-on-one relationship, all they need is 2 or 3 friends if they're more introverted. If they're more extroverted, they probably need a group of people. And, if they have an interest still, so if they do crafting, or if they're interested in bikes, there's usually so many meetups, but you want to find the ones that do have people their age. And it does take work, but I think it's worth the time to help them develop a few good friends. They don't need a lot.
Right.
And again, if they're introverted, they really don't need a lot of days during the week to socialize. Maybe just 1 or 2 a week, maybe 3. If they're extroverted, they're going to probably need, something going on every day. Otherwise, they're going to get drained if they don't have any interaction.
It's an interesting kind of that you've said that, introverted and extroverted. And I think of Chuck, and then I think of my own father, who is very, I would say, extroverted too. He kind of thrives on the interaction with people.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that fascinating, because he and I have that kind of, and my sister have that in common. We're not introverted to the extent that being in crowds kind of drains us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was having a conversation with some people about politics, of all things, and these were like, this was last night after a meeting, and there was a younger person who had a completely different opinion. And so it was neat. I was like, hey, I enjoy that conversation. It doesn't stress me out. But for Chuck, my father-in-law, he has a pretty strong opinion about things. And he does, and we're noticing that he does like to spend time with us. He likes to talk about what he was watching on TV and what was relevant in the news. And so my wife and I are going, yeah, we need to encourage him and to try to get out there. I'm sensing in him that he wants to do it, but he doesn't know how to do it.
Yes.
Or where to do it. And that's what we're kind of now, my wife and I are like, okay, where do we go find that? Because we're not 87. We're not that. It was like, how do we go find those people? So we know that that's going to be the work in front of us.
Yeah. So church, senior center, if those are available, but there are, we hired my dad a caregiver for just a couple days a week because we wanted him to get used to somebody as he would need more. And we wanted to keep it in his budget, but we also wanted him to have some companionship because we take him to his church and he just sits in the corner and he doesn't interact with anybody.
Oh.
But if you get his family together, he lights up. So what my dad wants all the family to come and stay with him, but he doesn't want to leave his house. So you have to figure out what your parent wants, but then you might not be able to give them what they want. So you just have to figure out things. So right now, my dad's getting used to the caregiver coming. We've tried taking him to church. My brother's still trying to think about different ways in that group to find maybe smaller group discussions. Can't really read anymore, so book clubs don't work, but a book club is a good idea if they're still reading and they've been great readers. But you really do have to put some effort into what are they interested in, what kind of people might share values with them. And you really have to find the people if it's your community. I mean, you've displaced them, right? They're not going to know how to go out and find people.
And I think that's a very important comment. And thank you, Carlos, for that, veterans comment that you made. I really appreciate it because Chuck did serve several years in the Army.
There you go.
Germany
centers. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's it. It's going to take a little bit of work, but I think that the benefit is going to be worth it. And I think that's
There are also, I just remembered, there are Alzheimer's support groups, and Alzheimer's is just one form of dementia. So really, there are memory care facilities where they have you take them, but like as we learned from our dad's caregiver, it's like there's a spectrum of things based on where you're at.
Oh, yes.
Right. So if you're still really active, then you want to do things that you're basically just looking for companions that are your age. And, there's more options there as you get more and more handicapped, let's say, where it's just a little bit harder for you to think through things and respond to people, and you get confused and scared. Then you need to go to more structured programs, and they do have adult daycares and those kinds of things as people start having a harder time coping.
I think, yeah, you're right. And for us, that is definitely on our list. It is important for my wife and I to make sure that we do what we can to help him establish that new routine. And we also are trying to manage our own expectations of how quickly we can do that. And so I think that because again, we're both very busy, but we also understand the necessity. And again, Chuck is not sitting there going, I really wish I had something. He's not dropping guilt bombs on us.
Mm-hmm.
But we also see that he really does light up when we come in and we can start to talk and engage. And his partner for many years passed just before he moved, and we really were sad about that. And he talks about how he had a lot of fun with her. And so he may not be able to find that replacement, and again, the timing was really unfortunate that he moves, and she passes, he moves, and it was tough. But we see that if we could find that, he doesn't need a lot. He's not going to go to the what is it? Go to some gathering where everybody's sitting around, drinking beer all day. He doesn't drink.
Yeah, or even to a senior center where everybody's singing songs. I mean, you have to find it really you have to kind of design it right to them. But yes. I do think if you can find somebody, if you can do the work to find somebody that they connect with. And so, it's going to be a little bit your work, and just invite somebody over for a dinner, start the conversation, see if they light up. And if they light up, then maybe the two of them will be able to continue the relationship after you facilitate it a little bit. And, try to do that with 2 or 3 friends, because I see it in my dad too. When he has people to talk to that he feels understands him, he will light up. When he has people to talk to that doesn't share his interest or that don't share his interests, he just withdraws, and he just, is not interested. I mean, at that age, you've lived your life, right? You don't need to hang out with people you're not interested in. So it is a navigation, but I think it's well worth the effort, because study after study after study shows that your neurology changes when you're connecting with other people. And I actually flew home to where my dad lives and lived with him and my brother for 5 weeks to try to organize things. So that you have a little bit more of a support system. But my brother told me, and I could tell, that my dad lit up when I was there, and he was happy the entire time, because there were people in his house, and people he knew, and people he trusted, and he would do little silly things like play the piano and joke around, and he hadn't been doing that before.
Wow.
And now that I'm gone, my brother says he's starting to get grumpy again. So it's interesting, you try, but it's not always easy. So it is definitely something to be committed to invest some time into.
Here's a question. Why didn't they tell us that all this in the beginning? Why didn't they sit there and say, hey, by the way, you're a teenager, you're in your 20s and your 30s, and oh, by the way, here's the handbook on how you're going to have to cope with and deal with your parent getting older?
I know, really. I mean, we have what to expect when you're expecting. So when you have the kids, you get all the handbooks, right? But what to expect when your parent gets older, they really don't have a lot of handbooks. Well, they might, but I just haven't read very many.
I don't, and I think that we kind of bump into the reality of this and kind of look around and go, wait, what happened? You can't give them back. They're there. Mm-hmm. And managing all of that, I think, is really important. And I just kind of laugh and think about all of the things that we've had to talk about. Estate planning, making sure all the bank accounts were making sure that my wife was on them, making sure everything was set up the way that, if anything did happen, you kind of have to start checking all of those boxes. And they are a lot of them. to really kind of get that perspective, like, okay, what do you need to do? And I know that AARP has a lot of resources. If people are looking for something like that, they talked about so many things of what is like for the person themselves, but there's
Mhm.
also a lot of resources for the family members.
Oh,
And I think,
good.
and that's important. So I think that's a really kind of good thing. The part of it that, again, that if you are struggling with your parent, they don't want to move, but they have to move.
Mhm.
There are things that you can kind of manage that expectation. If you're struggling with your parent, if you're struggling with your spouse or your partner, again, recognize those. This is a really critical thing. If you have to do it, you have to. An ADU, which is the kind of the topic here, you're building an
Mhm.
ADU on your property, you're moving them in there, is horribly expensive. One, it takes forever, a year to 2 years to design it and build it,
Mhm.
and then to move them in. So this is an ongoing kind of process. And so the point I want to reiterate is, you're feeling triggered, anxiety, mad, frustrated, resentment, all of those things. Take a breath, take a moment, and just say, okay, I'm not happy here at this point. You can make it better for yourself.
Yes, you can always make it better for yourself. And I think that's the point. I mean, we don't proactively plan for these things. I think the reason we don't is because most of our lives are full. And, you know, while we want to focus on what's important and what matters and not what's urgent, we do procrastinate on things that are more long term or seem like they're more long term in order to deal with all the urgent crises that we're dealing with in the moment, or all the craziness of our lives in the moment. Most of us don't have enough boundaries in our life to have much time to breathe. And when we do get that time, we want to do something fun. We don't want to do something like estate planning, right? Or planning on what to do when our parents get older. I mean, it's not inherently a wonderfully energizing thing to do. It's kind of a draining and sad thing. And it
Yeah.
makes you think about things you don't really want to think about. So I completely see why we procrastinate on it. The question is, when it's in your lap and you haven't planned, that's when the stress can skyrocket.
And I think that that's one thing I want to kind of spend some time talking about, is the incentive, and maybe, I don't know what your thoughts are going to be, framing a reward, what that reward is going to be. Because and I'm sharing for myself, the estate planning component it costs money, and it takes time, and it requires work. And a way that I frame it, the reward, is that it's going to make things so much simpler as, my wife and I age, and if anything were to happen to us, and my reward is, like, I would want it to be as smooth and as easy for her as possible.
Mhm.
And so I frame it as a reward, and being able to kind of look at it to go, okay, if we get everything kind of dialed in with Chuck, and we know that where everything is at, then if something were to happen, we don't have the stress of trying to figure it out.
Right.
So my reward is to say, okay, I'm not going to have to really have a much larger, uncomfortable, stressful situation. If I need to handle it now, so I don't have that.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing it, because if you think about why we do anything we do, we're really pursuing happiness, right? And then if you actually sit down and go, well, what's my version of happiness? Usually it involves quite a bit of peace of mind, right? I mean, most people's versions of happiness is kind of a contentment, an absence of crises. That's why we buy insurance, so that, you know, something happens, it's not as bad, right? So I agree. If we can really think through what are the things that are really going to make me happy, this planning process is part of what's going to keep me happy.
And I agree with that 100%. It is because there's so many aspects of your parent moving into your property. And I think that is what you want to try to do, and look at them, one by one, and try to tackle them and try to separate them out. You don't need to kind of lump them into some big, massive mountain that you have to try to climb. It is going to be, try to just do those little pieces, and try to kind of make that list and try to do those things. The part of it I think is going to be interesting. I want to is when there are the struggles. And I think that there are, and you said that in the beginning, when you have a sibling who is not carrying as much weight, is not carrying the responsibilities, but in the back of your mind, this is just me, that when something happens, they're going to have their hand out and they're going to be asking for their share.
Mm-hmm.
And how you deal with that, I think, is important. And if you are the person who has invested, hundreds of thousands of dollars, you've now let them live in the thing, and you've foregone hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then if the estate is significant or not significant, it doesn't matter. If there's a surviving sibling, they're going to want some share. And how you do that, I know we've touched on that a couple times in this conversation, but in your experience, if you are the person who owns the house, who owns the ADU, and you have family members, siblings who may be looking at an opportunity, how do you kind of set that up? And what is a recommendation? Because you see somebody who's not active, who's not helping, who's not doing what you in your mind thinks that they should. How do you either kind of set the expectations for yourself or for them, or do you?
Well, I think any kind of conversation you can have that's candid beforehand is important. And I think you're going to better have the conversation if you get less attached to whatever your idea is of what's fair. I think there are going to be siblings that are going to, let's say there's 4 kids in the family, they're going to expect that their share is 25% regardless of what you did versus what they did. And they're going to see it as very unfair if you had the parent stay with you, yet and then as in recompense for that, you decided that you're going to take 50% instead of 25%, and then the rest of them have to divide up the other 50% or something like that. You're going to definitely have 3 siblings screaming at you that that's not fair. So any kind of conversation about investments that you're putting in that feel above and beyond beforehand, I think, is important. So one of the things that our family is doing is, because my dad will not buy new furniture, and
Right.
we have furniture that's 30 years old, but he wants us to visit him. We've decided that we're going to invest in, so I bought a new couch for him when I was there, and my sister bought a new couch for one of our properties, and one of his properties. And I'll probably buy a new refrigerator for that property at some point, because it has to be replaced. It's leaking. And if I'm going to stay there, I have to have a good one. But what we've decided to do is we've created a Google Sheets, and to write down all the things that we're investing, all of us. And I don't know that we've had any kind of a conversation yet about whether that will then be reimbursed to us if there's anything before any division goes on. But it's not a lot of money yet for any one of us, a few $1,000s. But if it gets to be $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, I think you would need to take the conversation to the next step and say, all right, this is a big chunk of money. I'm willing to invest it now, only under the condition that that comes back out before the division happens. And you have to have the conversation, get the agreement, and probably get it in writing.
Yes. Some form of memorialization.
Right.
Whether it's email, something, say, hey, yes, I understand that we're tracking everything on the Google Sheet, and that before divisions are happening, whatever expenses I incurred, I'm going to get that out.
But only if they agree, because, for example, they may not agree that we needed a new couch or a new refrigerator. So there's that conversation about, do you as my siblings believe that this is something I should be reimbursed for? Like, I bought tons of stuff when I was there that I don't think anyone would care if I had bought or not. And I realized that that's just on me. That's not something I'm going to get reimbursed for. That's something that I chose to buy, and it's on me. And so I think we need to know for ourselves where those lines are. And I think we need to be a little bit humble about it, because sometimes we just do things. It's like when you have kids, you spend money on them and you don't expect it to be returned to you.
What is this? I thought of another situation. What if the sibling is not doing what you think they should do? And you're trying to facilitate that. Let's say spending time. Let's okay, you can come and have dinner with dad. You can come take dad to dinner. You can give me a night off. oh, no, well, it is, excuse.
Yeah.
It's like, and so how do you say it would really be great if you did? You can come on. And there's that. I'd be interested to see, because you're trying to get somebody to come do something that they are resistant to. And it may be because they have a much different dynamic with the parent than, alone. And so that may be something where we're like, oh, maybe, that sibling doesn't want to go spend, the one-on-one time with the parent. They're much more comfortable if it's, the four of us together. So we look at it and kind of go, maybe that's not an expectation that we're going to be able to benefit from.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really have to separate the two issues, because there is every sibling has their own dynamic with their parent, and they're at their own stage of life when the parent goes through certain things that they need. And it's never balanced. Some people have in their head that, every sibling should spend, their percentage of time. If there's 3 kids, 33% of their time, having quality time with the parent. It never divides up that way, because some siblings have stressful things going on in their life. Some siblings live closer than the other ones. So some people enjoy the quality time more. Some people need more time to themselves. So I don't think, if you're getting resentful of something that you're giving to your parent, and your solution to that is to have your siblings do more of their share, that's always going to go bad. Get the time and space you need, set the boundaries. Don't expect your siblings to set the boundaries for you or to fill in on the boundaries.
That what you just said right there is a conversation that people should have. That exact statement is 100% probably one of the most important things somebody could do. And I think that the people kind of get their triggers, they get their frustrations, and they don't realize it's like, uh-oh, I need to be able to navigate this. I can hear you say all that, and I go, that makes sense. But if I were to try to implement it on my own and try to do that, I might get a little overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And that's where you would be able to say, okay, we're going to work on that. We're going to be able to, and it's going to take some time, because if you think about it, it's not really one conversation saying, okay, why don't you just have coffee time for an hour when you get home from work?
Mm-hmm.
This is a lot bigger. It's a lot
it can be.
And it can be very big, particularly depending on the relationship that you have with your sibling and you have with your parent. But I would suggest you ask yourself, what is it worth for your quality of life, for your relationship with your spouse, your partner? What is it worth for the relationship with your parent, to improve it, and to understand that you might be resentful of this next thing. You have the control to be able to improve it yourself.
Yes.
And you may be a little resentful that you're having to take the time and the money to improve yourself, but you now have the control and the ability, hopefully, to really control and to improve everything around you.
Yes. Yeah. Our boundaries are our responsibilities, and we cannot control our siblings, and their perception of their life is going to be very, very different from our perceptions of our lives. Our siblings usually don't experience life the same way I do. We do. There are birth order issues that are going to make a difference in how we've even experienced the same family. So thinking that our siblings should do something a particular way, or a parent should want something a particular way, is not going to serve us, and it's out of our control. But we really need to take a look at what are our needs for a quality life, and what are our values. And if we value having a good relationship with our parent, but maybe we don't care so much about some of our siblings, that's fine. But the important thing is, get the time you need on your own, get your needs met on your own. Don't sit there and get mad because your sibling's not, quote unquote, pulling their weight. Don't expect your sibling to pull their weight. Get the weight pulled if you have to hire out or whatever, but don't make assumptions about what your siblings' lives are, what their experiences are, how hard it is on them, because honestly, someone else's life always looks easier from the outside. They always look like they're not doing as much. or that they're happier or whatever, but they've got their own things that they're going through, their own experiences that they're having. And if you have needs, it's really important for you to do the work to get those needs met. And you can get those needs met. Like, let's say you need a night off. Get the night off. Don't expect your sibling to take over. There are other ways to take the night off. Maybe your parent's going to be just fine having a night on their own. Thursday night's my night out, so I won't be around to say hello to you tonight, but I'll see you on Friday,
And yeah, and that goes to the child's expectations, or not knowing what the expectations are, or just thinking they have to do something when they necessarily don't have to. And we've said that many times. It's like, don't make the assumptions, and to be
Yes.
able to kind of do that. And I want to kind of get this thing sort of wrapped up, because I've been so appreciative of your time, but I'd like you to spend a couple of minutes talking about what you do as far as offer, and what options are there for people who may be looking to say, I need some help.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I do. The easiest thing is to just contact me, go to the website. I think you have links to the website, right? Go to the website. There's a contact form. You can schedule a consultation. The consultation's free. It's a phone call. It's about 20 to 30 minutes. And we talk about your situation, and then I can make some recommendations. Typically, there's a few different ways people work with me. One-on-one, usually can buy a package of sessions, 5 sessions, 10 sessions, something like that. That would be the most typical thing that I think someone in this situation might do. I often do programs. So for example, I have a boundaries boot camp. So I don't offer that every year, but sometimes I offer, and if you get on my email list, you'll get notified when I offer it. And it's 8 weeks of talking about boundaries in a group setting. So there are some classes that I offer that you can jump into, and you get notifications of those classes. I also have some free workshops that I give. And a lot of times the theme is boundaries and stress management. And so you can get some good tools that way.
And yes, and thank you. I know that, again, and if you haven't been here since the beginning, or you're just tuning in a little bit later, I got a lot out of those sessions, because I did those with you for a while.
Mhm.
And I have to tell you that there is something when you talk to somebody who has a different perspective, but also kind of is holding you a little bit accountable.
Yes.
It's like, okay, you're here, you want to change something. Okay, let's do that. And so that's where you have to have that kind of responsibility to kind of follow some of those guidelines and those recommendations, because it can really improve your interactions, whether it's with a coworker, it's with a partner, somebody you work with, and spouse, parents, whoever. It is just kind of really sort of managing those expectations. And for those of you who are here, thank you very much for joining us live and
Yes,
for the
thank you.
questions. Yeah, and feel free to reach out. And if you're watching this or listening to it, if you have any kind of questions, again, email Nahid, email me. We're hopefully going to be able to have this conversation, sometime in the future, because I know that an 87-year-old, they change. My wife and I, we get older, have to deal with new things. And if there's any sort of insights that I want to share, I'd really be able to appreciate to have that conversation with you, Nahid, because this has just been really fantastic. And again, for all of your time, thank you. It was great. And Carlos, thank you very much for that compliment. He just said it was been very insightful. So we really appreciate that. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Have loved being here.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Ready. Bye-bye.